The Battle of Guadalcanal stands as one of the most pivotal and transformative campaigns of the Second World War, marking the moment when the pendulum of the Pacific conflict began to swing in favor of the Allies after months of relentless Japanese expansion. Fought between August 1942 and February 1943, the campaign was far more than a simple clash over a remote island. It was the first major offensive undertaken by the United States and its allies against Japan, a test of wills, logistics, strategy, and endurance that would shape the course of the Pacific War. When Japanese forces began constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal in mid-1942, the island, little known to the world, covered in dense jungle, plagued by disease, and strategically situated along vital sea routes, suddenly became a flashpoint in the broader struggle for control of the Pacific. For the Japanese, the airfield promised a launching point for future offensives, a threat to Allied supply lines, and a stepping stone toward isolating Australia. For the Americans, seizing the island became a crucial necessity. Allowing Japan to complete and operate the airfield would jeopardize the entire Allied position in the South Pacific. Thus, the decision to launch Operation Watchtower, the first amphibious assault of the war by U.S. forces, marked not only a military gamble but a psychological turning point, signaling that the Allies were ready to halt Japanese momentum and seize the strategic initiative. The early stages of the campaign unfolded with a mixture of boldness and uncertainty. American Marines landed on Guadalcanal and neighboring islands almost unopposed on August 7, 1942, capturing the unfinished airfield, later renamed Henderson Field, with surprising ease. Yet this initial success masked the enormous challenges ahead. The Marines were now isolated, lacking heavy equipment, short on supplies, and dependent on tenuous naval support. Within days, the U.S. Navy suffered a devastating defeat in the waters around Savo Island, forcing American ships to withdraw and leaving the Marines stranded. This sudden reversal brought the fragile reality of the situation into sharp focus. The battle had only just begun. The months that followed became a grinding struggle for command of the land, sea, and air, with each domain shaping the fate of the others. Control of Henderson Field proved central to the entire campaign. Whoever held the airfield controlled the skies. Whoever controlled the skies influenced naval operations. And whichever navy dominated the surrounding waters dictated the flow of supplies and reinforcements essential for sustaining ground forces. The Japanese, unwilling to relinquish the island they viewed as essential to their defensive perimeter, launched repeated attempts to retake it. Their strategy relied heavily on nighttime landings and devastating naval bombardments, while their elite infantry units attempted numerous ground offensives aimed at overrunning American positions. But each attempt, while ferocious and often costly for the Americans, ultimately failed, largely because the airfield enabled Allied aircraft, the Cactus Air Force, to strike Japanese ships by day and protect American supply convoys. Meanwhile, the dense jungles of Guadalcanal became a crucible of suffering. Soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable hardships. Malaria swept through ranks with staggering speed. Torrential rains turned camps into swamps. Food shortages left many men gaunt and weak, and the psychological strain of constant bombardments, surprise attacks, and sleepless nights eroded morale. For Japanese troops, the situation was even direr. With American air superiority and Allied naval advances gradually choking off their supply lines, thousands of Japanese soldiers starved or succumbed to disease long before they ever faced the enemy in combat. Still, their determination never wavered. Time and again, they mounted desperate assaults like the battles of Edson's Ridge, the Matanakaw, and the brutal December offensives, seeking to break the American perimeter and recapture Henderson Field. Each attack, though fierce and often tactically sophisticated, crashed against the entrenched American defenses, which had strengthened as reinforcements and artillery slowly arrived. At sea, the struggle for Guadalcanal escalated into some of the most ferocious naval battles in history. Between August and November 1942, American and Japanese fleets clashed repeatedly in the narrow waters around the island, earning the region the grim nickname Iron Bottom Sound due to the number of ships sent to the seafloor. Battles such as Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and the naval Battle of Guadalcanal demonstrated not only the brutality of modern naval warfare, but also the shifting balance of power. While the Japanese Navy inflicted heavy losses, their inability to deliver sufficient reinforcements ultimately doomed their efforts on land. Henderson Field's American aircraft, combined with improving U.S. radar and night fighting tactics, steadily eroded Japan's naval advantage. By late 1942, the Japanese High Command confronted the grim reality that Guadalcanal had become a strategic trap. Their soldiers were wasting away, their ships were being sunk at a rate we could not replace, and the Allied presence on the island continued to grow stronger. After months of unrelenting effort, the Imperial Command made the difficult decision to evacuate remaining forces in January and February 1943, ending their struggle for the island. When the last Japanese troops slipped away under the cover of darkness, the Battle of Guadalcanal effectively ended, marking Japan's first major defeat on land and altering the trajectory of the Pacific War. The victory at Guadalcanal was more than a tactical success. It was a profound strategic and psychological turning point. It ended Japan's hopes of further expansion, safeguarded Allied supply lines to Australia, and opened the door for the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific over the next 2 years. The battle also revealed the extraordinary resilience and adaptability of the soldiers, aviators, and sailors whose determination made victory possible. Guadalcanal demonstrated that the Allies could not only withstand the Japanese offensive, but could seize the initiative and carry the fight across the ocean. The campaign forged new doctrines in amphibious warfare, tested the limits of logistics and endurance, and laid the foundation for future operations that would ultimately bring the war to Japan's doorstep. In this way, Guadalcanal became far more than a single battle. It became the moment when the Pacific War changed direction, when hope replaced fear for the Allies, and when Japan's aura of invincibility was shattered forever. The struggle for the island, its airfield, its ridges, its choking jungles, and its blood-stained beaches, remains a testament to courage under the harshest conditions, a story of determination against overwhelming odds, and a defining chapter in the epic history of World War II. The story of Guadalcanal does not begin on the island's jungle-covered ridges or on its narrow beaches, but in the vast geopolitical struggles unfolding across the Pacific in the early 20th century. Long before the first Marines stepped onto the shores of Lunga Point in August 1942, the region had become a battleground of ambition, ideology, and military strategy. The Pacific, once viewed as a distant expanse of ocean, suddenly became the center of gravity for the world's most powerful nations. It was here that the Japanese Empire sought to establish dominance and secure resources, while the United States and its allies fought desperately to halt a wave of conquests that threatened their strategic lifelines. Japan's rise as an imperial power can be traced to its victories in the Russo-Japanese War and its subsequent expansion across East Asia. By the 1930s, driven by militaristic ideology and scarcity of natural resources, Japan set out to create what it termed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This lofty phrase masked a harsher reality. Japan intended to dominate the Pacific region politically, economically, and militarily. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931, the full-scale attack on China in 1937, and the slow but deliberate tightening of control over Southeast Asia set the stage for a dramatic confrontation with Western powers. As Japan pushed outward, its ambitions increasingly clashed with the United States, which depended heavily on Pacific trade routes and maintained crucial ties to the Philippines, China, and Australia. Tensions escalated sharply when the U.S. imposed embargoes on oil and steel shipments to Japan, materials that were vital to the Japanese war machine. With negotiations failing and resources dwindling, Japan reached the conclusion that war with the United States was inevitable. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was not merely a strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet, but the opening move of a sweeping offensive designed to cripple American power and establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. In the months that followed, Japanese forces conquered vast territories with astonishing speed. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies all fell in rapid succession. For the first time since the early 19th century, Western colonial powers found themselves pushed out of Southeast Asia, and the Pacific seemed to tilt decisively in Japan's favor. The Allies were reeling, struggling to regroup, reorganize, and rebuild a defensive line that seemed to crumble with every passing week. Yet, despite these setbacks, the tide began to shift. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and the decisive American victory at Midway in June halted Japan's momentum. Although the Japanese Empire still controlled an enormous expansive territory, it no longer possessed the overwhelming naval superiority it had enjoyed earlier in the war. For the first time, the United States had seized the strategic initiative. American military leaders understood that although Midway was a major turning point, it would not by itself win the war. The U.S. needed to go on the offensive and quickly. This is where Guadalcanal entered the picture. Located in the southern Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal appeared at first glance to be just another tropical island, covered in thick jungle and surrounded by treacherous reefs. But its importance became undeniable when American reconnaissance planes discovered that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on its northern shore. If completed, the airfield, known later as Henderson Field, would enable Japan to threaten Allied supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. This single airstrip had the potential to sever the Allies' lifeline in the South Pacific, weakening their strategic position and isolating Australia. Recognizing this danger, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized Operation Watchtower, the first major American offensive of the Pacific War. It was a bold and risky move, undertaken at a time when American forces were still recovering from earlier defeats and were short on manpower, supplies, and modern equipment. Nevertheless, the operation was seen as essential. If the Allies could seize Guadalcanal and hold it, they would not only protect the critical supply routes, but also establish a forward operating base from which to challenge Japanese control of the Solomon Islands and eventually the rest of the Pacific. To appreciate why Guadalcanal became so critical, one must understand the strategic geography of the Pacific. Unlike Europe, where railways, roads, and rivers connected nations, the Pacific theater was a vast expanse of ocean dotted with islands. These islands served as stepping stones for naval and air operations. Whoever controlled them could project power across thousands of miles, protect supply lines, and threaten enemy territories. Guadalcanal was perfectly positioned within this island chain. It sat along the crucial route between the United States and Australia and provided a base from which Japanese forces could launch operations against Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia. The loss of these territories would dramatically weaken the Allied position in the Pacific and limit their ability to launch counteroffensives. By mid-1942, Japan had established what it believed to be a strong defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to New Guinea in the south. Yet this perimeter had several vulnerabilities, and Guadalcanal was one of them. The Japanese had only recently begun construction on the airfield, and the island was lightly defended compared to other positions. This presented the Allies with a rare opportunity, a chance to strike before Japan could fully fortify its position. At the same time, the United States was rapidly expanding its industrial base and producing ships, aircraft, and equipment on a massive scale. The country was gearing up for a long war, and American military leaders were eager to demonstrate that the U.S. was capable of conducting large-scale amphibious operations. The invasion of Guadalcanal would serve as a test. It would reveal whether American forces could coordinate naval, air, and ground operations across vast distances, a skill that would be essential for future campaigns such as those in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The road to Guadalcanal was not merely a physical journey, but a strategic and psychological turning point. For the Japanese, it represented a dangerous intrusion into what they believed was their rightful sphere of influence. For the United States, it symbolized the first step toward reclaiming the Pacific and challenging Japanese expansionism. The stakes could not have been higher. Both sides understood that the outcome of this campaign would shape the course of the war in the Pacific. In many ways, the decision to invade Guadalcanal marked the moment when the United States transitioned from defense to offense. The early months of the war had been dominated by Japanese victories, leaving Americans anxious and uncertain about the future. The attack on Pearl Harbor was still fresh in the nation's memory, and the loss of the Philippines had been a devastating blow. But the victories at Coral Sea and Midway had restored confidence, and the planned assault on Guadalcanal offered a chance to seize the initiative and prove that the Allies were capable of reversing Japanese gains. Meanwhile, Japanese leaders underestimated the American resolve to launch such an ambitious operation so soon after suffering major setbacks. They believed that their defensive perimeter was strong enough to deter any significant Allied offensive. They failed to anticipate that the U.S. Marines would land on Guadalcanal and seize the nearly completed airfield in a matter of days. This miscalculation would prove costly, setting the stage for a protracted and brutal campaign that neither side had originally expected. Guadalcanal would become a brutal proving ground. The island's dense jungles, oppressive humidity, and disease-ridden swamps created a hostile environment that challenged even the most experienced soldiers. Supplies were difficult to deliver, communication lines were fragile, and the terrain made movement slow and dangerous. The Japanese believed their troops were better suited to jungle warfare and initially assumed they could overwhelm the American forces with superior night-fighting skills and aggressive tactics. However, they underestimated the resilience of the U.S. Marines and the growing strength of the American naval and air forces. The stage was set for one of the most intense and consequential campaigns of the Second World War. The fight for Guadalcanal would involve not only bloody ground combat, but also some of the most ferocious naval battles ever recorded. It would test the limits of military endurance and reveal the strategic importance of seemingly insignificant patches of land in the Pacific. What began as a small operation to seize an airfield would evolve into a 6-month struggle for control of the entire Solomon Islands. As the first chapter of the Guadalcanal story comes to a close, it becomes clear that this campaign was far more than a simple fight over territory. It was a clash of empires, strategies, and ideologies. It was a test. In the early hours of August 7, 1942, the stillness of the South Pacific was shattered by the thundering roar of American naval guns, marking the opening phase of Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive against Japan during the Second World War. The invasion of Guadalcanal, along with nearby Tulagi and the Florida Islands, represented a bold gamble by the United States. It was an unprecedented amphibious assault, carried out by a military still recovering from the devastating early months of the war. No one knew whether the operation would succeed or fail, but American commanders understood that it had to be attempted. The Japanese advance had to be stopped, and the newly discovered airfield on Guadalcanal could not be allowed to become a launching point for enemy operations against Allied supply routes to Australia. The decision to launch Operation Watchtower was made swiftly, almost reluctantly, by the U.S. High Command. After the victory at Midway, intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal. If completed, it would give Japan the ability to threaten communications and transport routes between the United States and Australia, routes essential for reinforcing the Allied presence in the Pacific. American strategists realized that allowing Japan to operate from Guadalcanal would significantly disrupt future campaigns in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and beyond. Thus, despite limited resources, the U.S. Marine Corps was ordered to carry out the assault. Planning for the operation began in June 1942 and was completed in just a few weeks, an astonishingly short time for an invasion of this scale. The Marines under Major General Alexander Vandegrift would form the primary landing force, supported by a naval task force commanded by Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The operation was divided into several objectives: seize Tulagi and its nearby islets, capture Guadalcanal's airfield, and establish a defensive perimeter for future operations. Yet even as plans were drafted, there were doubts among senior officers. Admiral Fletcher worried that the fleet lacked sufficient aircraft carriers to protect the landing force. Supplies were scarce, and the Marines were short on experience, equipment, and intelligence about the island's interior. Despite these concerns, the invasion force, nearly 19,000 Marines, sailed from Fiji in late July. Many aboard the transports had no idea where they were headed. Secrecy was essential, and rumors spread among the men about their destination. When word finally circulated that they were bound for Guadalcanal, most Marines reacted with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The Solomon Islands were largely unknown to Americans, a remote chain of tropical islands far removed from mainland battles. But to the military leadership, Guadalcanal represented the opening foothold in a long and arduous campaign to push Japan back toward its home islands. As the invasion fleet approached Guadalcanal, the Marines prepared for the landings with a mixture of tension and determination. Many were young and inexperienced, having never participated in an amphibious assault. Their training had been rushed and often improvised, and few could have imagined the harsh environment awaiting them. Still, morale was surprisingly high. The victories at Coral Sea and Midway had strengthened confidence, and the men believed that the Japanese, though formidable, could be defeated. Before dawn on August 7th, the American fleet steamed into position. Fletcher's carriers launched aircraft to conduct reconnaissance and attack Japanese positions on the islands. The bombardment that followed was intense. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed a barrage of shells onto coastal positions, jungle ridges, and suspected enemy strongholds. The sky filled with smoke, and the echoes of gunfire rolled across the island. Yet the Marines did not know that many of the Japanese laborers constructing the airfield were not soldiers, but Korean and local workers with minimal defenses. The Japanese combat troops in the immediate area were limited, leaving the airfield vulnerable. At approximately 9 a.m., the first wave of Marines headed toward Guadalcanal's beaches in landing craft. Amphibious operations are inherently chaotic, and this one was no exception. Some landing craft drifted off course, others became stuck on reefs, and a few Marines stumbled ashore disoriented. But to their surprise, the beaches were virtually undefended. The bombardment had missed the Japanese camps entirely, but the Japanese presence on the southern part of the island was thin. The majority of Japanese troops were stationed on Tulagi and the nearby islets, leaving Guadalcanal's landing zones poorly guarded. The Marines quickly established a beachhead and began moving inland toward the airfield. The dense jungle, tangled vegetation, and oppressive humidity made progress difficult. The men were weighed down by packs, rifles, and ammunition as they pushed through the thick underbrush. Yet opposition remained minimal. Many Marines began to wonder whether the Japanese had fled deeper into the island or were preparing a trap. The absence of resistance created an eerie atmosphere, one that contrasted sharply with the fierce fighting taking place on Tulagi and neighboring islands. Indeed, Tulagi saw some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the initial assault. As Marine raiders and parachute battalions landed on the smaller islands, they encountered determined Japanese defenders who fought to the last man. The caves, ridges, and dense foliage provided natural fortifications for the Japanese, turning the fighting into a brutal struggle of grenades, rifle fire, and hand-to-hand combat. By the end of August 8th, the Marines secured Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, but at significant cost. The ferocity of the Japanese resistance stunned many American troops and foreshadowed the kind of relentless, no-surrender mindset they would encounter throughout the Pacific War. Meanwhile, progress on Guadalcanal continued. On August 8th, Marines reached the airfield and discovered that the Japanese had nearly completed it. Construction equipment, fuel drums, vehicles, and partially built structures were scattered across the area. The airfield's capture was a major strategic victory, one that would shape the course of the campaign. The Marines immediately began preparing it for Allied aircraft, and within days it would be renamed Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. However, even as the Marines secured the airfield, disaster struck offshore. On the night of August 8th-9th, Japanese naval forces launched a surprise attack on the Allied fleet in the waters north of Guadalcanal, later known as the Battle of Savo Island. In what would become one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history, the Japanese sank 4 Allied cruisers and damaged several other ships. Admiral Fletcher, concerned about the vulnerability of his carriers, withdrew his forces from the area. This decision left the Marines ashore with limited supplies, little naval support, and no immediate means of reinforcement. Many Marines viewed the fleet's departure as abandonment, and morale briefly plummeted. Operation Watchtower had begun successfully on land, but now the Marines found themselves isolated. Supplies remained scattered on the beach, unloading was incomplete, and essential items like barbed wire, medical equipment, and heavy artillery had yet to be brought ashore. The Japanese, recognizing the threat posed by the American occupation of Guadalcanal, began preparing a counterattack. They were determined to retake the island and expel the Americans before they could establish a permanent foothold. Despite the challenges, the Marines held their ground. They fortified defensive positions around the airfield, dug trenches, and set up perimeter defenses. The humid climate, torrential rainstorms, and swarms of insects made the task arduous. Food shortages soon became a major issue, as the limited rations brought ashore were quickly consumed. Marines resorted to eating captured Japanese rice, often crawling with insects, to supplement their meals. The significance of Operation Watchtower was enormous. For the first time, the United States had seized territory previously held by Japan. The invasion marked a shift in the strategic balance of power in the Pacific. What began as a modest attempt to deny Japan the use of an airfield would escalate into a prolonged and brutal campaign involving thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The Japanese High Command was stunned by the audacity of the American offensive, and soon realized that Guadalcanal could not be abandoned. They began sending reinforcements, troops who would launch repeated attacks to dislodge the Marines from their precarious positions around Henderson Field. Henderson Field became the center of gravity for the entire Guadalcanal campaign, the strategic prize that both Japan and the United States were willing to sacrifice thousands of lives to control. What began as a partly completed Japanese airstrip evolved into a lifeline for American forces and a symbol of defiance. The moment the Marines captured the runway, it became not only a tactical objective, but the very heartbeat of the island. Every decision, every attack, every defense, and every sacrifice made during the long months that followed revolved around keeping Henderson Field operational. Without it, the Americans would have been isolated, vulnerable, and ultimately overrun. With it, they could challenge Japanese sea and air superiority, defend vital supply routes, and maintain their tenuous foothold in the southwestern Pacific. When the Marines seized the airfield on August 8, 1942, they found construction equipment, fuel, and vehicles abandoned by fleeing Japanese workers. The airstrip itself, though incomplete, was well on its way to becoming functional. The Marines immediately understood that finishing the airfield was the highest priority, more important even than securing large parts of the island. Engineers, construction battalions, and Marines with little experience in airfield operations worked day and night to complete the runway. Under the scorching sun and frequent tropical rains, they filled craters, cleared debris, and repaired damage while always keeping their rifles within reach. The threat of Japanese counterattacks loomed constantly, and every shovel of dirt carried the weight of survival. On August 20th, the first American aircraft, a squadron of Marine F-4F Wildcats and SBD Dauntless dive bombers, landed on the newly christened Henderson Field. Known collectively as the Cactus Air Force, their arrival marked a turning point in the campaign. For the first time since landing on Guadalcanal, the Marines possessed air support capable of challenging Japanese bombers and fighters. Until then, enemy aircraft had flown overhead uncontested, bombing the Marines' positions and attacking naval vessels offshore. With Henderson Field operational, the balance began to shift. The Cactus Air Force was a patchwork unit made up of Marine, Navy, Army, and even some New Zealand pilots. Their aircraft were often worn, their supplies limited, and their maintenance crews overworked. Yet their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. They flew multiple missions each day, intercepting Japanese bombers, strafing enemy ground forces, and providing close air support to Marines in the field. The airfield gave the Americans a powerful advantage during daylight hours. Japanese supply convoys, known as the Tokyo Express, could only operate safely under the cover of night, and even then they risked coming under air attack the moment dawn broke. Despite its importance, Henderson Field was always vulnerable. The Japanese understood that destroying the airfield was the key to driving the Americans off Guadalcanal. They launched relentless air raids from Rabaul and other bases in the northern Solomons. Waves of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and A6M-0 fighters attacked almost daily, turning the skies over Guadalcanal into battlegrounds of smoke, fire, and twisted metal. The Marines dug rows of foxholes around the runway, taking cover during bombing runs, then emerging to repair the damage as soon as the enemy departed. Some days the airfield was bombed multiple times, leaving craters scattered across the runway and filling the air with dust and shrapnel. Japan also attempted to recapture the airfield through ground offensives. The first major attempt came in late August when Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite infantry regiment launched a reckless frontal assault against Marine positions near the Ilu River, known to Americans as Alligator Creek. Ichiki's attack was a catastrophic failure. The Marines, well dug in with machine guns and artillery, decimated the Japanese force. Nearly 800 enemy soldiers were killed in one night, shattering the myth of Japanese invincibility and revealing how determined the Americans were to defend Henderson Field. But the Japanese were far from done. In September, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi led a reinforced brigade through the jungle, attempting to outflank the Marines and strike at the airfield's southern perimeter. This attack, remembered as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge, became one of the most intense engagements of the campaign. The Japanese fought with ferocious discipline, launching repeated nighttime assaults under the cover of darkness. The Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson, held their ground against overwhelming odds. Exhausted, bloodied, and nearly out of ammunition, they repelled the Japanese wave by wave. Their victory saved Henderson Field from what would have been near certain capture. Throughout these battles, Henderson Field functioned as both fortress and lifeline. The aircraft stationed there played a pivotal role in defending the Marines against ground assaults. Reconnaissance flights spotted Japanese troop movements, while dive bombers blasted enemy positions before they could reach American lines. Fighter pilots risked their lives to intercept bombers before they could drop their deadly cargo on the runway and surrounding defenses. The airfield also enabled the Americans to strike Japanese ships attempting to deliver reinforcements. Every transport sunk, every supply barge destroyed, weakened Japan's ability to sustain its forces on the island. The will to keep Henderson Field operational became a symbol of American resolve. Conditions for the men defending and maintaining the airfield were harsh. Malaria spread rapidly, turning strong Marines into feverish, weakened shadows of themselves. Food shortages were constant, particularly after the Japanese naval victory at Savo Island disrupted supply lines. Many Marines survived on stale Japanese rice, moldy rations, or whatever they could scavenge. Thousands of men lived in muddy foxholes, surrounded by insects, disease, and the constant threat of enemy attack. Every day was a battle, not just against the Japanese, but against the unforgiving environment. The Japanese attempted several more major assaults throughout the autumn of 1942, including the massive Battle for Henderson Field in late October. This time, Japanese forces launched a coordinated attack from multiple directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders. The fighting was brutal. Machine guns spewed fire into the darkness, artillery shells burst among the advancing enemy formations, and bayonet charges turned parts of the battlefield into scenes of chaos and desperation. Yet the Marines, now reinforced by Army units, held firm. The Japanese assault collapsed, resulting in devastating losses. From that point on, the Japanese were never again able to mount a serious ground threat to the airfield. Still, Henderson Field remained a target for air and naval bombardment. Japanese battleships and cruisers repeatedly shelled the airfield at night, attempting to crater the runway and destroy aircraft on the ground. Some bombardments were devastating, leaving the runway pockmarked and equipment destroyed. Yet each time the Marines and Seabees worked tirelessly to repair the damage. At dawn, aircraft would once again take off, often from a runway that had been nearly destroyed hours earlier. Henderson Field was far more than a runway. It represented a strategic shift in the Pacific War. Its continued operation demonstrated that the United States could seize and hold critical territory in the face of determined Japanese resistance. Its aircraft weakened Japanese logistics, defended American ground forces, and challenged enemy control of the surrounding seas. The field became a beacon of hope, a symbol of American determination, and the anchor of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. By the end of 1942, Henderson Field had transformed from a vulnerable makeshift airstrip into a well-defended stronghold. It was now home to an expanding fleet of aircraft, more advanced facilities, and a growing network of support personnel. The Japanese had thrown their best troops and most aggressive strategies at the airfield, yet it remained firmly in American hands. Its survival ensured that the United States would maintain the initiative in the Pacific, setting the stage for the decisive naval battles still to come. The struggle for Guadalcanal was not confined to the dense jungles, muddy ridgelines, or the battered runway of Henderson Field. The waters surrounding the island, narrow, dark, and treacherous, became the scene of some of the most violent naval battles ever fought. Control of these seas meant control of the island itself. Whoever dominated the waters could reinforce their troops, deliver supplies, and shape the future of the campaign. For 6 months, the waters around Guadalcanal, later called Iron Bottom Sound due to the number of ships sunk there, became a graveyard of steel. The naval battles fought here were chaotic, bloody, and often decided in minutes, yet their consequences shaped the entire Pacific War. From the very beginning, American forces understood the precariousness of their position. After the Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the Japanese quickly recognized the threat to their defensive perimeter and moved powerful naval forces south to counter the invasion. The Japanese Navy, arguably the finest in the world at the time, possessed superior night fighting skills, better torpedoes, and a fleet of highly trained crews. In contrast, the U.S. Navy was still learning how to fight a modern war in the Pacific. Many of its officers lacked combat experience, its ships lacked effective night optics, and its crews were unfamiliar with the ferocious tactics the Japanese preferred. Yet despite these disadvantages, the U.S. Navy was compelled to hold the waters around Guadalcanal. Without naval support, the Marines ashore would be isolated and starved of supplies. Every ship sunk, every convoy turned back, and every engagement fought in these waters had a direct impact on Henderson Field and the troops defending it. For this reason, the naval battles around the island were not merely engagements of steel and fire, they were desperate struggles for survival, waged by sailors who knew that failure meant the destruction of their comrades on land. The first major clash came on the night of August 8 through 9, 1942, in what would become known as the Battle of Savo Island. The American and Australian cruisers patrolling the waters north of the island expected only minor Japanese resistance. Instead, they were caught off guard by a veteran Japanese task force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. In a ferocious night attack lasting less than an hour, the Japanese used their deadly Type 93 long lance torpedoes and expertly coordinated gunfire to devastate the Allied fleet. 4 cruisers, USS Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra, were sunk, and more than 1,000 Allied sailors were killed. The Battle of Savo Island was a catastrophic defeat, one of the worst in U.S. naval history. More importantly, it forced Admiral Fletcher to withdraw his carriers, leaving the Marines ashore with limited naval protection. While the Marines continued to fight on Guadalcanal, the Navy was haunted by the disaster. The Japanese victory was not complete, however. Mikawa withdrew without attacking the vulnerable American transports, believing that daylight air attacks from Henderson Field would destroy his force. This decision would haunt the Japanese command for the rest of the campaign. Despite the early setbacks, the U.S. Navy remained determined to challenge Japanese control of the waters around Guadalcanal. The battles that followed were characterized by confusion, limited visibility, and brutal close-range engagements. Throughout August and September, Japanese destroyers and cruisers, part of what the Marines called the Tokyo Express, raced down the Slot, a narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, to deliver reinforcements and supplies. These night runs were swift and deadly, designed to exploit Japanese superiority in night tactics. The U.S. Navy often struggled to intercept them, and when it did, the resulting battles were chaotic. One of the earliest of these clashes occurred in late August during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Unlike Savo Island, this battle involved aircraft carriers and was fought largely in the skies. American and Japanese carrier aircraft launched wave after wave of attacks seeking to gain the upper hand. The battle ended in a strategic American victory, as Japanese reinforcements were delayed and the carrier Ryujo was sunk. The Japanese carrier Shokaku and Zuikaku also suffered damage and pilot losses, weakening Japan's carrier force for future operations. Though Henderson Field remained vulnerable, the Japanese found it increasingly difficult to deliver the reinforcements needed to overwhelm the Marines. Still, the Japanese pressed on. September saw another major engagement, the Battle of Cape Esperance. This time, the U.S. Navy achieved a measure of redemption. A task force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott intercepted a Japanese fleet attempting another reinforcement run. Using radar, a technology the Japanese lacked, Scott's forces achieved surprise and sank the cruiser Furutaka and a destroyer. Although the victory was not decisive, it boosted American morale and demonstrated that the Navy was learning and adapting. But the most decisive sea battles were yet to come. October and November brought some of the fiercest naval fighting in history. The Japanese, determined to retake Henderson Field, began assembling a massive force of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports for a final assault. Their plan was to bombard Henderson Field into uselessness, land thousands of reinforcements, and overwhelm the American defenders. The U.S. Navy, though still recovering from earlier losses, was determined to prevent this. The first clash of this campaign came in mid-October, when Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna shelled Henderson Field that night. Their massive guns inflicted enormous damage, destroying aircraft, fuel supplies, and runways. Yet the airfield survived. Engineers and Marines worked tirelessly through the night, and by dawn, aircraft were once again taking off to challenge Japanese reinforcements. The stakes rose dramatically in November 1942 when the Japanese launched a series of operations designed to finally crush American resistance. The ensuing battles, collectively known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, were among the most violent naval clashes ever fought. Over the course of several days, American and Japanese ships clashed in a series of chaotic night battles. The first of these occurred on November 13th. A Japanese force, including two battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, moved in to bombard Henderson Field. Opposing them was a much smaller American task force composed mostly of cruisers and destroyers. The battle that followed was brutal, fought at point-blank range. Ships passed so close to each other that they could fire directly into enemy bridges. The destroyer USS Laffey fought with such ferocity that Japanese sailors later swore they had been attacked by a mad ghost ship. The Americans suffered heavy losses, but their sacrifice forced the battleships to turn back before completing their mission. The second phase of the battle unfolded on November 14th, when American aircraft from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to land reinforcements. Dive bombers and torpedo planes struck repeatedly, sinking transports and killing thousands of Japanese soldiers still on board their ships. The sea burned with oil and debris, and entire companies of Japanese troops drowned before ever reaching shore. The final confrontation came on the night of November 14th to 15th. The Japanese battleship Kirishima, supported by cruisers and destroyers, attempted another bombardment of Henderson Field. This time, it was met by the battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a matter of minutes, Washington's radar-directed guns turned Kirishima into a blazing wreck. The Japanese retreated, their final major attempt to take Guadalcanal thwarted. By the end of these battles, the Japanese Navy, once the most feared maritime force in the world, had suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of aircraft, dozens of warships, and thousands of sailors were gone. Japan could no longer sustain its operations in the South Pacific. Meanwhile, American naval power grew stronger, bolstered by new ships, improved tactics, and veteran crews hardened by the brutal realities of night fighting. The naval battles of Guadalcanal were decisive not just for the campaign, but for the entire Pacific War. They shattered Japanese sea power, secured the waters around the island, and ensured that Henderson Field and the Marines defending it could survive. The cost was immense. Iron Bottom Sound became littered with the wrecks of American and Japanese ships alike. Yet out of this floating graveyard emerged a turning point. For the first time, Japan's naval power had been decisively challenged and broken. The Allies had seized the initiative at sea, opening the path for future invasions across the Pacific. The struggle for survival on Guadalcanal was as fierce and unforgiving as the battles fought in the skies and seas surrounding the island. For the American Marines and later Army reinforcements, as well as for the Japanese troops entrenched in the dense, humid jungles, daily life became a war against nature itself. The campaign that had begun with strategic objectives soon devolved into a grueling test of human endurance. Men on both sides confronted the limits of their physical and mental strength as disease, malnutrition, and constant stress gnawed at their resolve. The brutal conditions transformed Guadalcanal into a crucible where resilience became as essential as weapons and ammunition. From the moment American forces established their foothold and seized Henderson Field, they found themselves thrust into an environment utterly alien to their experience. The island, lush in vegetation yet hostile in climate, was a breeding ground for malaria-carrying mosquitoes, rampant fungal infections, and relentless tropical heat. The lack of reliable sanitation, clean water, and basic supplies made the threat of illness ever present. Every foxhole, trench, and bivouac became a battleground not just against Japanese attacks, but also against unseen enemies that stole strength silently and steadily. Malaria quickly became the greatest adversary of the Marines, surpassing even the threat of artillery or surprise assaults. The disease swept through American ranks with staggering speed, leaving men feverish, delirious, and incapacitated. Official records later estimated that over half of the American force on the island contracted malaria at some point during the campaign. Men often fought while shaking uncontrollably, their bodies ravaged by fever and chills. The quinine and atabrine tablets intended to control the disease were in short supply, and at times soldiers resisted taking them due to rumors of unpleasant side effects. Despite medical directives, discipline in preventative medication was difficult to enforce as exhaustion and despair overtook the ranks. The Japanese suffered even more severely from disease. Their supply lines, already fragile due to Allied naval superiority, could not reliably deliver medical supplies, food, or reinforcements. Soldiers arriving on the island often carried inadequate rations, usually just a few days' worth of rice, and relied on foraging in an unfamiliar environment. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition reduced entire units to shadows of their former strength. As the campaign dragged on, Japanese troops increasingly collapsed from starvation rather than bullets. Survivors recalled nightmarish scenes of comrades too weak to stand, their bodies wasted by hunger and chronic illness. Food scarcity shaped the daily experience of every soldier on Guadalcanal. American logistics, though strained, benefited from periodic naval support that brought canned goods, powdered milk, and hardtack. But these rations were often insufficient, and fresh food was a rare luxury. Marines grew gaunt as weeks of limited nutrition eroded their body mass. Many survived on small, repetitive meals, lacking the energy needed for continuous labor in combat. The jungle offered little relief. Few edible plants were familiar or safe, and hunting animals was nearly impossible under the operational pressures of war. Japanese forces faced a far more desperate situation. Their supply attempts, conducted through the perilous Tokyo Express, were inconsistent, risky, and often disastrous. Cargo was frequently lost to American bombardment, and what did reach the island was seldom enough. Soldiers starved slowly, their energy reserves depleted to the point where they could barely carry rifles or perform basic tasks. Many Japanese diaries found after the war reveal haunting accounts of men scavenging the island for bark, roots, and insects in a futile effort to stave off starvation. Fatigue was a constant companion. American troops rarely slept more than a few hours at a time, their rest interrupted by bombardments, patrol duties, and the omnipresent threat of night attacks. The Japanese, known for their violent nocturnal assaults, inflicted psychological torment even when not launching full-scale offensives. The tense silence of the jungle at night became a source of anxiety, as every rustle or movement could signal the beginning of another deadly engagement. Sleep deprivation left many Marines jumpy, irritable, and prone to errors that further endangered their positions. The psychological strain of Guadalcanal rivaled the physical hardships. Soldiers wrestled with fear, uncertainty, and isolation. Many felt cut off from the world, trapped on a hostile island where death could come from a sniper's bullet, a lurking disease, or simply the collapse of their exhausted bodies. Letters home often conveyed a quiet desperation, tempered only by determination to complete the mission. The Japanese, equally isolated, experienced their own psychological torment as supply failures signaled a grim reality. They were being abandoned slowly by the empire they served. Yet moments of resilience shone through the darkness. Camaraderie became a lifeline for American troops. Marines shared jokes, stories, and small comforts like cigarettes or coffee to lift each other's spirits. Medics performed heroic efforts to treat the sick and wounded despite limited resources, improvising treatments and fighting tirelessly against disease. Chaplains offered spiritual support, while officers worked to maintain morale through leadership grounded in empathy and resolve. The Japanese displayed their own forms of resilience, rooted in discipline and duty. Even as starvation ravaged their forces, many soldiers continued to obey orders and defend their positions with remarkable tenacity. Their endurance, though shaped by a harsh military culture, was also fueled by camaraderie and a sense of shared suffering. Many Japanese units maintained cohesion, even as they dwindled to a fraction of their original strength. Ultimately, the struggle for survival on Guadalcanal highlighted the brutal truth of jungle warfare. Victory was not determined solely by strategic brilliance or superior firepower, but by the ability to withstand an environment engineered by nature to break the human body and spirit. The men who fought there emerged forever changed, their memories shaped not only by battles, but by the long nights of fever, the gnawing ache of hunger, and the relentless press of despair. The final phase of the Guadalcanal campaign represented the culmination of 6 months of relentless combat, attrition, and psychological strain for both American and Japanese forces. What had begun as a bold but uncertain Allied landing in August 1942 transformed, by the end of the year, into a decisive struggle that would permanently alter the balance of power in the Pacific. As the campaign approached its conclusion, each side recognized that control of Guadalcanal, particularly its vital asset, Henderson Field, would determine the future trajectory of the war. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters, pressured by mounting losses and diminishing resources, sought one last opportunity to reverse the tide. The Americans, confident but battle-worn, prepared for a final series of offensives designed to eliminate the last pockets of Japanese resistance on the island. By late November 1942, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. The Americans had won several key naval battles, including the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, which crippled Japanese efforts to reinforce their ground forces. Control of the sea allowed the U.S. to deliver steady supplies, reinforcements, and heavy equipment to the island. In stark contrast, the Japanese faced catastrophic shortages. Their nightly attempts at resupply through the high-risk Tokyo Express failed to provide enough food, ammunition, or medical supplies to sustain their increasingly exhausted troops. Malnutrition, disease, and battle fatigue had reduced entire Japanese battalions to skeletal remnants of their former strength. Commanders were forced into desperate measures, urging soldiers to continue fighting despite being physically incapable of sustained combat operations. The American command, recognizing the collapse of Japanese logistics, shifted its approach from defensive operations to aggressive, coordinated offensives. The arrival of fresh Army units, particularly the 25th Infantry Division and the Americal Division, gave U.S. forces the manpower needed to push inland and target the remaining Japanese strongholds. the focus shifted to the Gifu, Mount Austin, and the fortified hills that served as the backbone of Japanese defensive lines. These positions, dug deeply into the rugged terrain and camouflaged by dense jungle, proved extraordinarily difficult to assault. Japanese defenders, despite starvation and illness, fought with the desperation of soldiers who understood that defeat on Guadalcanal meant the collapse of Japan's entire southern strategy. The battle for Mount Austin began in December 1942 and would continue into January 1943. American units encountered fierce resistance as the terrain favored defenders who used concealed machine gun masts, snipers, and interconnected tunnels. Progress was slow and costly. Even with superior firepower, U.S. infantry often advanced only a few yards at a time, forced to clear each foxhole and bunker in brutal, close-quarters fighting. Rainfall turned slopes into mud, slowing artillery support and making evacuation of the wounded extraordinarily difficult. Yet the Americans persisted, using coordinated assaults, mortar fire, and continuous pressure to weaken Japanese positions. Gradually, the defenders were pushed back, their lines unraveling under the weight of sustained attack. As January progressed, the Japanese command reluctantly confronted the impossible reality of their situation. Their troops were dying faster from starvation and disease than from American bullets. Supplies no longer reached the island, and even elite units such as the 2nd Division had been reduced to fractions of their original strength. Recognizing that any further attempt to hold Guadalcanal would result only in the annihilation of their remaining forces, the Imperial General Headquarters issued its first major strategic withdrawal order of the Pacific War. The evacuation, codenamed Operation K, was disguised as another reinforcement mission to deceive American forces. Through a combination of careful planning and night maneuvering, the Japanese successfully evacuated over 10,000 surviving soldiers in early February 1943, using destroyers to extract troops under cover of darkness. By February 9, 1943, American forces declared Guadalcanal secure. The campaign had lasted 187 days and marked Japan's first major strategic defeat of the war. The significance of the victory extended far beyond the island itself. For the first time, Japanese expansion had been halted and reversed. Guadalcanal shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and demonstrated that determined, well-supplied Allied forces could overcome even the most entrenched and disciplined defenders. The psychological impact was profound. American morale surged, while Japan grappled with the realization that its industrial base could not sustain prolonged attritional warfare against the Allied powers. The aftermath of the campaign revealed the staggering human cost. Over 7,000 Americans and tens of thousands of Japanese had been killed. Many of the Japanese dead had perished not in direct combat, but from starvation, tropical disease, and exhaustion. Survivors on both sides carried deep psychological scars, shaped by months of unrelenting pressure, fear, and hardship. The jungle of Guadalcanal became a symbol of the brutality of Pacific warfare, a place where men were pushed to their physical and emotional limits. Strategically, Guadalcanal opened the door for the Allied island-hopping campaign that would eventually lead to Japan's defeat. With the southern flank secured, the United States could begin advancing through the Solomons, New Guinea, and ultimately towards the Pacific Sea and Japan's home islands. Henderson Field, once the focal point of desperate struggle, now served as a launch point for Allied air operations that steadily eroded Japanese naval and air capabilities. In retrospect, the final push on Guadalcanal was not simply the conclusion of a long and bitter campaign. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. The American victory signaled a fundamental shift in momentum, demonstrating that Japan's capacity for offensive expansion had reached its limits. From this moment forward, the Allies would maintain the strategic initiative, pressing their advantage across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Guadalcanal became a testament to endurance, sacrifice, and the profound consequences of control over a single strip of land in a global conflict. The legacy of the campaign remains deeply etched in military history. It stands as a reminder that wars are not always won through grand maneuvers or overwhelming force. Sometimes they are won through the sheer will of individuals, soldiers who hold the line under impossible conditions, who fight through hunger, disease, exhaustion, and despair. The final push on Guadalcanal was their triumph, a testament to human resilience and a pivotal moment that helped shape the outcome of World War II.